Hello. So in this lecture, we start to consider pottery in greater detail. So the thing about pottery is there's a bewildering variety of it, which is a wonderful thing, and enables archaeologists to understand things about the people of the past through it. So what I want you to do is to learn how we can differentiate between different types of pottery. And there's various ways of doing that by simply looking at it. One is to actually look at how it is made. So it's important to understand construction techniques. A well-known form of making pottery is to throw it on a wheel. So evidence of throwing on a wheel includes this whorl inside. If you remember that video I showed you where the lump of clay on the wheel just simply came up with the potter sticking his hands in the middle of the pot, this is the result of it, with that force of the centrifugal force of the clay being thrown out by the wheel. It very easily comes up. You can see this in the archaeological record as well. You also find these fine lines, fine parallel lines. If you remember, I was telling you about pottery thrown from the hump and then cut with a string. And so when you find that somebody's held a piece of string here and then pulled it around and pulled off a piece of the ceramic vessel from a lump of clay, then this is probably thrown on a wheel, most certainly, in fact. There's various other forms of evidence to look at how the pottery is made, including xeradiography. Very difficult to do nowadays because there's hardly any xeroradiograph machines, but it enables you to look at the structure within the pottery. You can actually look at the pottery by looking at the broken edges, so that is another area of information. Here, for instance, you can see the broken edge of a piece of pottery. There's various other lines of evidence here. So there's the fine lines I showed you on that piece of pottery. Here we have decoration applied as it's on a wheel. So that's another clue. And also when it gets thick at the bottom and gets slowly thinner and thinner and thinner till it's at the top, that's also likely means it's going to be thrown on a wheel. Now the structure of it, if there are any elongated inclusions, then they will be oriented like this when you're looking at the side of the pot. If you're looking at a broken section, they will look like this. So this is again a good way of having a look to see how the vessel was made by looking at the broken section, looking at inclusions within it. Possibly the simplest type of construction is a pinch pot. So you just pinch the pottery and it tends to look a bit like this. Looking at the broken sections, you will see that the pressure from each side, from the pinching, creates a flat profile, but looking at the surface is completely random. If we just go, I can't go back very easily. See here, it's not random, although the broken section looks more or less the same. And it makes very simple forms. And if you recall, our very early Neolithic pottery from the Middle East looks just like the sort of forms that were made from a pinch pot. Although they may also be drawn somewhat, which is basically you pinch it and then you pull it up towards the rim, and you will then get orientation of grains like this. Slab construction is very important. Certain lines of evidence to suggest something's made with a slab is looks like it's made of slabs. It's pretty self-evident, really. You have slabs, you can roll it out like you can with a rolling pin, make a flat piece of clay, and then you just glue the parts together with more clay, with slip, basically. And so that is pretty self-evident in some cases when you look at a square vessel, an orthogonal vessel like this. Or one like this, you see. So clearly this has not been thrown on a wheel, it's not been made by any other way. These are slabs which have been put together. This is less obvious, but you can see that it has these breaks which are parallel to the rim. All of these vessels seem to have that. And so that again would be evidence of a slab, and that the vessel is made up with slabs, and that is where the weakness is. Looking at the weaknesses of regular breaking in the pottery will also give you an idea of what's going on. So those sherds were probably breaking somewhere like this, where the slab was made near the rim, and so it will break into these blocks. So if you're looking closely at the inclusions, again the grains would be oriented parallel to the sides. If you're looking at a broken section, and if you're looking at the surface, then they'll be quite random. Coil construction, of course, is very important, and so you can see this lady is made up a whole bunch of coils. She's got it on a mat to turn it around to make it more even. Coil construction will create a very random section, because if you can imagine, it's made of a whole bunch of coils, each of which have a specific orientation within the coil, and then they're all smooshed together. However, they all align very closely parallel when you're looking at the surface. And they also make it very irregular break, or they may have breaks which show where the coils were built up. Very rarely you see evidence of the coils in the vessel itself. Here is some coil construction I photographed in Iran in 1997. These people were making very large pots. You can see here is the big mixing vat where they worked the clay to soft. And here you can see this lad is rolling the coils, the clay into coils. And here you can see, presumably his dad is making a vessel with these coils. And they're making bread ovens, and so they have to be polished on the inside. That's what this chap's actually doing here. He has a bit of a surprise, because when I was here to see these potters, I could hear this strange noise coming from the back, and I go back to see what it is, and this boy pops out of this pot like that. There he goes. And what he's doing is he has this little stone, and he's burnishing the inside to make it better for making bread, which is probably what this chap is doing. He's polishing a coil pot. So mold construction, you basically have a mold. Here's a mold. Well, it's actually a fragment of a mold. You can see it used to be a whole thing that looked like a bit like this. And so then the clay is put into the mold, and then possibly it's dry, or right away you just pop it out, and you have the thing you're trying to make, more or less. This would probably have the bottom would be from another mold, and then you'd use slip to attach the two together. The little handle here would have to be attached, but then you have the vessel. So there's a number of lines of evidence to tell you that this is molded. One is that it doesn't have, it's not obviously not thrown, because it's not round, you see. So it's round here, but this isn't a round vessel. It's like this pointy vessel like this. And so clearly this has not been thrown. And another line of evidence is the decoration. If you look at decoration, and it's linear quite often like this, you see, this linear relief decoration, and you can see that the line sticks up from the vessel, it's been molded. Because what they're actually doing is incising the mold. And so what you're looking at is essentially what would make this easy to make, because potters don't waste a lot of time. And so is this potter going to, at great pains, work this with a tool or something to create this design? Or is he going to just quickly create a design in the mold, incising the lines, Bob's your uncle, pops out the mold, and there it is. And clearly he's going to, or she is going to use a mold. Here we have some potters, and they're using these big molds to make these rather large jars. And you can see the seam between them. So that's another line of evidence to see mold construction. There's often a seam. And you can see they're taking off the seam. See, here's an unmodified seam. Here it's been removed, but you can still see where it was. And so there's still some line of evidence to show that that was made in a mold. This I feel is actually the ugliest pottery in the known world. It's made in Iraq mostly, and in the area. It's typically related to the Uruk period, although this one supposedly is Chem Nasser period, and it's called a bevel rim bowl. And there's a lot that people think about this thing. It's indicative of the Uruk period. And some people have hypothesized it's made by making a hole in the ground and putting clay in it. So it's molded, but the mold is just the ground, which is why it's quite that rough looking. So, lines of evidence for pottery that's been made in a mold. The seam, you see, it'll be weak and may crack along there, again here. This is not a very good thing for a mold, so that's probably unlikely. This is a good thing for a mold. This is not a good thing for a mold, although you could actually put the two pieces together. This is another possible line of evidence. You can see here that there is this very fine grit, sand or silt or something, which is on the surface of the vessel. And this is what is known as a parting medium. And basically what they've done is add this to the inside of the mold and added the clay, and so this makes the clay not want to stick to the mold, and so sometimes you'll find this parting medium. Turning pottery, which is different from throwing pottery, although you'd still use a wheel. So what you do with turning is you throw a vessel and then you, say, turn it upside down, as you do in this case. And you mount it on the wheel again. And as it's turning around, you use a tool to cut it down. And so if this has been cut off of a big lump of clay, what this will be doing is just to make a nice bottom. Here, again, this rounded bottom, if it was thrown on the wheel, would not be as it came off of the wheel. It would have like a flat bottom where it was attached to the wheel. And so if you wanted a round bottom, you would put it up back on the wheel and turn it with a tool. This will leave evidence of turning. You'll have those fine parallel lines from the hand, but you'll also have these lines when it was turned, and you wait until the pottery's leather hard, and so what you'll have is like inclusions will be dragged across the surface like this. You also may have very different appearance of the thickness of the vessel up in each side of the base like this, and it may not be centered properly. Here we have a potter turning. So here he has his wheel, and it's a kick wheel, and he's kicking underneath here, and as it's spinning around he's using this tool to cut away, making the bowl finer and making a nice foot ring on it. Shaved. Shaved is like turning, only it's not turning. Basically, you just get a sharp tool and scrape away. And it's obviously not very parallel. It's not been done on a wheel. This may be shaving on this pot. Trimming is sort of like this. See, this is the same image of this chap turning the vessel, but basically it's using a tool to cut parts of the clay. Paddling, saw an image of this earlier. Using the paddle and anvil technique, he'll have in his hand something like a big round rock, and he'll have here a wooden paddle to paddle away at the outside. This sometimes may leave impressions as a decoration, but often it won't. But it will often leave a vague trace here of the anvil inside, the paddle on the outside, maybe a decorative one as I just showed you. The surface will be very parallel, and the impact will often create little cracks. Modeling. Modeling is basically like making a model of a dinosaur with plasticine, like you did when you were a child. And this is how things like this are made. You just have a piece of clay and you squish it with your hand until you have the thing you wanted. So you don't get this to build a lot of vessels, but you might have things like handles applied like that. So once you have constructed your vessel, there's a number of types of decoration which are also done while the pottery is before it is fired, and it's sort of a part of the forming process. One of these is burnishing, and in which you will take something like, say, a nice shiny rock, and you will polish the outside. You'll rub the outside or the inside of the vessel, and the point of this is that it will push any non-clay inclusions further into the body and orient the clay inclusions so they're parallel to the surface. So that makes it very shiny, and you'll create this nice shiny surface simply by rubbing the outside of the vessel with a pebble. Incision is from here you can see something has been used to incise the ceramic. So again, this is done before the firing. Excision is where you've cut bits out. Molded also forms decoration. Applique is where you apply bits. See this bit here? It's had these little bits of clay being added to create a pattern, applique. Impressed is where you will impress something. This has had some sort of fork impressed into it or done individually, whereas this has had a stamp of some sort pressed into the clay. Sprigging. Sprigging is where you have a little piece of clay and it's stuck on with a tool like this. And so basically you put the piece of clay on the end of the tool and pushed it into the object there to make the eyes. Punctate. Punctate forming is when you put a hole through something. Modeling again is decorative. Repoussé is when you push out from inside. So you stuck your hand inside and pushed it out. See how it's sticking out here. Combing. They've used something to comb the surface of the clay. Rouletting, they've used something to roll over, rather like a cylinder seal, only it creates this this pattern. So let's go back. That's the types of decorative forming. So all of these are quite important. You see each one got a green arrow, so you should remember them. These are less important. You can see them all at one go. Studying the form or shape of ceramics is very important to archaeologists. This, for instance, is a piriform vessel. It's pear-shaped. Now, the thing about these geometrical shapes is that they may be used in all sorts of ways. And so what you need to do is look at how they affect your pottery. Here is an example of my research where I looked at how this pottery was being formed. And so I called these segmental bowls. These are conical bowls. They're made of a simple cone shaped. These are made of two cones. These seem to be somewhere in between. Chronologically they were. and it's a cone, and it's sort of flat at the bottom, so, but it's sort of halfway between this and this. And so you need to look at the actual specific forms you have to really decide what you want to call them. Features on pottery, and there's all sorts of features. They're all pretty self-evident, and you would know what they are looking at them. Here, for instance, is a pedestal base. And so when you're studying the pottery, you need to do your own deciding what it is you're looking at. These, again, are from my own research, and they are rims of bowls from Egypt in the medieval period, about 975 to 1025, made in Old Cairo, Fustat. And they have these bowls like this with slight recurve rim, as it's called. They have these conical bowls like this, and they have these. As you can see, they're a bit like the recurve rim, but they're actually flat. This is the succeeding phase, and you can see they also have vessels rather like this. However, there is a major distinction. There's a number of differences between this vessel and that, unlike the taller foot ring, for instance, you see. These are all consistently taller and more at an angle. These are shorter and vertical. But also these flat rims, although continuation, are different. And I called these, and, you know, some people will come up with some silly, well, I don't have to say it's silly, but I think it's kind of silly. Basically giving it a letter or something, form C6 or something. I like to come up with memorable names for my bizarre forms, and I call this the camel rim because it looks a lot to me like the profile of a camel. So if you look at it, you see this, see there's the head of the camel, and there's its neck. You imagine it goes down, there's a hump here, you see there's its legs, and this is the head of the camel. And if you look carefully, this is an alert camel, you see. It's just come out of the oasis, and it's just been well watered and rested, and it feels alert. But this is a relaxed camel. See, it looks tired. It's just arriving at the oasis after a long trek across the desert. So this is the relaxed camel, and this is the alert camel. What actually happened with these is that this has been finished with a tool, which is very different from this, which has not been finished with a tool. Here it's just been turned over with the potter's hand to make this lip. It's not a lip, it's just a flat rim. But this, they've used a tool. And this is actually very important because this reflects motor habit patterns. Motor habit patterns are really what you're studying when you're looking at pottery, when you're trying to distinguish between one form and shape and decoration and another. You're looking at the motor habit pattern of the potter because they're not artists, they're craftspeople, and they're just trying to make the pottery to make a living. And so they will be making lots of them. And so if a potter in this phase picks up a tool to finish this rim to make it completely flat, and this one does not, that is a very important distinction. That's a major change in motor habit pattern, and it's actually a subsequent phase. So that's the sort of thing you want to look at. So back to making the pottery. Slip is very important. Slip is clay in suspension. And so what you have here, you see, is the same material as what's made this pottery, but it's in suspension. So they swooshed it around in water, won't let it settle, and they're pouring it over the vessel. In fact, this guy is dipping it. He's taking this pot and he's going to dip it into this big pot of slip. And this will cover the outside with a very fine, a thin layer of very fine clay. And so this is sort of like the burnishing technique I was telling you about, where it creates a lot more clay on the surface. And so in this case, it's pure clay, which has just been poured over the surface or put on the surface by dipping it into it. So this makes a very fine surface. Here you can see this chap got a pot and he's pouring it over the vessel to create a full slip. You can also have a partial slip, which is probably how what this lady is doing. You see she's wiping slip over specific parts of the pot. Here, see this chap is putting slip on the inside. He's swooshing around again and pouring it out. So here you can see some of these pots he's done is he's not slipping the outside, he's just slipping the inside. So that would be a partial slip or part slip. You can have slip paint. A lot of ancient pottery is actually slip paint. It might have color in it. There's a lot of manganese and iron and things like this. This is a white clay. And so these things are painted with a clay-based paint. Or in here the whole thing is, and leaving reserve bits. This is slip incised, in which you have a vessel is covered with slip, and then you incise through the slip to reveal the darker body underneath. And that's what this design is. The man on the horse with a bow is actually created by incision through the slip to reveal the underlying red clay body. And then it's been painted with colorants. This is slip excised. This is where it's been removed in large areas. Then you have a false slip. A false slip is when you have salts crystallizing on the surface to make it lighter than the underlying body. So you can see this is quite a light surface, and the underlying clay is actually much redder. Then you have a self slip, also called a wet hand finish. This is another way of creating a clay rich layer on the outside. And what you do is just you have your hand, it's wet, that's why it's called a wet hand finish, and you smooth it over the surface. It's very easy if it's, say, spinning on a wheel or something like that. And while you're doing that, what that does is bring the clay out to the surface to make this more clay rich layer right near the surface of the vessel. This in fact is not a self slip, this is actually a slip, because you can see a clear boundary between a slip and the body. This is a thin section if you're not sure what it was. So this is a slip, but a self slip, it would just sort of fade directly into the body, and sometimes only by thin sectioning it can you tell the difference. So glazes are glassy surfaces on the outside of pottery, but for that we'll go to the next lecture. So that's our introduction to ceramics, and more ceramics will be coming up in the next lecture. Thank you.